This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. That is the important part, the without killing each other part. I'm your host, Corey Nathan. It is an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. And we'll be doing that today. I'm really excited about the guest that we have, someone who's become a friend, but I will introduce our special guest in a second. Before I do, just remember, subscribe or follow, depending on what your app lets you do. Leave us that rating and especially write a review. The reviews in particular really do help us get noticed by the big apps like Apple in particular. I'll put that link in our show notes to make it easy for you to find our page on Apple, write that review. All of it helps get the word out so more folks can be a part of this conversation, like the one we're having today with Elizabeth Neumann. Elizabeth Neumann served as the Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Elizabeth is an ABC News contributor. I'm her warm-up act, by the way. She's about to go on ABC after we do this recording. Elizabeth is also the Chief Strategy Officer at Moonshot, which builds solutions for one of the most pressing challenges facing communities around the world, and that is violent extremism, which we'll be discussing today. Elizabeth is also the author of an important new book, Kingdom of Rage: The Rise of Christian Extremism and the Path Back to Peace. Elizabeth, it is so cool to see you. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me back, Corey. It's really fun to get to talk to you about this book and the work that I've been doing the last few years.
Yeah, it seems like since the first time we talked was right about the time that you began this project in earnest, and you've had your head buried in books and research and writing and this whole project for a few years. And what's really cool is that we've subsequently become friends, you and Gil, and so that's kind of cool. How has this writing project been for you? It's like a whole new thing that you've done, a whole new skill.
I knew when I said yes to this project that it would be hard. It was more than that. There's so many amazing, good things. I'm glad I did it. Also, I'm so glad it's done. So that it's a lonely process to do writing. There are parts where you are engaging with other people, but mostly you're reading a lot, you're writing and rewriting a lot, and I'm quite the extrovert, so that was a really hard process for me to get to spend so much time alone with my thoughts. But it was good. It forced me to really think through everything from hunches and hypotheses to like things that I really knew, but I hadn't been able to have the time to figure out the right way to explain it to a layperson. So I really did appreciate the process. Also really glad that it's done.
Yeah. So I'm curious about that process. Was part of it just reflecting on your experience and then because the book is filled with, surveys and facts and quotes and, it's a very fact-based book. So I was curious how your process went, thinking about your own experiences and then recounting them and backing that up with, with the surveys and other empirical information, or was it based on conversations that you had that kind of motivated you to go and start writing and working out your thoughts? Or how was that process overall for you?
Well, I suppose it started from a place of just my experience, right? Like I've been in the counterterrorism world since 9/11, and I was in Washington, D.C. on 9/11. And I actually describe in the book the experience of fleeing the city and looking in my rear view window and seeing the Capitol in the background and wondering if it was going to be there tomorrow, because there were still rumors of more airplanes in the sky. And we knew at the time that they had been targeting big, iconic places like the Pentagon and the World Trade Center. So kind of seemed pretty obvious to those of us in DC at the moment that, like, they would target the White House and they would target the Capitol. So I remember driving out and just praying, like, Lord, let this end. Let us be safe. It was just, it was so fearful. We didn't know what was happening. And of course, on the other side of that experience, I was very young, and I just kind of made a promise that I would do whatever it took, however I could help the fight, to make sure that we would never have another day like that. Like that still drives me today. But then, in 20 years later, we did have a day where the Capitol got attacked. Thankfully, not nearly as horrendous as 9/11 was, but it was an attack that came from within. And it not only came from within, it came from my community. I was raised a Christian. I am a practicing faithful Christian now. I was very involved in Republican Party politics early in my career, throughout high school, college, and the first part of my professional life, and I couldn't grapple with the thing that I had been working for 20 years to protect. Not only did we not protect, we failed. Like, the security community failed on January 6th, but we failed because we didn't see the threat coming from within. We didn't understand what was happening, and so it really compelled me. I had held this strong belief that if we asked the Muslim community in America to speak out the moderate interpretation of their scriptures and explain what jihad really is and that it's not violent, if we ask that of them, shouldn't we be asking Christians to be much more articulate about how our scriptures say that violence is not the solution, that violence is not Jesus's way?
Yeah.
And shouldn't conservatives find in their own, if you're not religious, you can still find anchored in our principles this idea that the beauty of our republic is that we can fight things out without violence, that violence is not the solution. And it kind of compelled me to really unpack that and figure out, how can I communicate this to my community, that we have got to push back against these violent tendencies that are coming from within.
There are so many threads that you just introduced there that are interwoven throughout Kingdom of Rage, throughout the new book. So I want to take a step back for a second, because I'm curious about how you grew up, your time at UT Austin. Faith. It sounds like faith has been a part of your life since you can remember. But was public service has been a part of your adult life, certainly post 9/11. Was that also where you were headed, like when you went to UT?
I was very fascinated with government, and I wouldn't say that it was a core value of our family. Like, nothing wrong with public service, but I didn't come from a military family where it's like deeply ingrained. Most of my, extended family were doctors and accountants and businessmen, entrepreneurs, that kind of stuff. So I was kind of a little bit odd man out for my family. And then, I guess I was in middle school and high school when I really started paying attention to politics, and I found it fascinating, and I found the law fascinating. I contemplated going to be a lawyer at one point, but I just kind of naturally knew that somehow I wanted to be involved in the government sphere. I wasn't really clear on what that sphere should be. And quite frankly, I don't know that I ever made a decision. 9/11 kind of just changed everybody's trajectory. At UT Austin, I happened to be there when George W. Bush was running for the 1998 gubernatorial election, and I worked for the Republican Party of Texas as a student. And then he, of course, ran for president, and I interned on the campaign. And then when he won, everybody was like, you can come if you want. So I actually left school early and had to finish later because, when do you get the opportunity to just kind of go join the presidential administration? It was such a great opportunity. And I initially worked on the faith-based and community initiatives, worked at HUD and Department of Education, and was really passionate about policy wonky stuff. Like, the politics was interesting, but like I actually do like the policy side. And so that was kind of where I was. 9/11 happened, and then everything changed. It was all hands on deck.
I do want to ask you that because you've already alluded to these bookends, 9/11 and January 6th. But first, I did want to ask you also about your faith. At one point, I forget where it was, but I think I've heard you talk about this. Your faith seems to be a part of you, like your DNA in a way. Like you think your Grams or grandma, you know. So was there a moment for you when you came to your own understanding of your theological convictions, of your faith, if you will, and now having gone through what we've all gone through and what we've seen devolve over these last few years, have there been moments later on in these recent years when you've begun to question that faith?
I don't know that I'll answer that last part first. I didn't question my faith recently. I questioned the community's interpretation of our faith.
Right.
But we can circle back to that in a second. I was raised in a home that treated the Bible very seriously. My mom tells the story that we were living in Georgia at the time, and when she was pregnant with me, she was doing K. Arthur Bible studies back in the 70s, right? So before K. Arthur was a big brand name. And if anybody knows anything about K. Arthur Bible studies, they're inductive Bible studies. They're very rigorous. There's lots of homework. That's the thread of evangelicalism that I came out of, very intellectual focused, and just very, very serious about the scriptures. And in some ways that probably protected me from other parts of evangelicalism, which got more involved in politics in the 1980s and the 90s. When I was writing the book, I spent a lot of time with my parents asking, were you aware of what was happening in First Baptist Dallas during this time frame?
Was that Jeffress Church?
Yes. So what was interesting to me is that it's not that my parents and my upbringing doesn't reflect a lot of evangelical commentary today. There are a lot of books out about what it was like to be raised evangelical in the 1980s and 90s. I certainly experienced that culture, but the protective factor for me, and I use that term specifically because it's a term that we use in describing how do we build resilience to radicalization. So one of the protective factors I identified for myself was that my family, as much as they thought political activity was an important aspect of being a good citizen and being a good Christian, the Bible was always first and foremost. That was the thing that that was our guidepost, and that kind of kept me grounded. But I did walk away from the faith a little bit in college and early professional years, not in a rejection kind of way, just I wasn't, I was busy and it didn't seem that relevant to me. And you often hear about people talking about how Jesus is your savior, but not your Lord. He was my savior. He wasn't my Lord. And I had a series of events happen now about coming up on 20 years ago that really kind of broke me and forced me to grapple with what I actually believed. And the Lord in his goodness brought me back. And I have kind of really focused on maintaining not only that head knowledge, but the heart connection to what it means to be a follower of Jesus. So that really in some ways prepared me for what happened. It was about 7 years later when you really started to see the church change in its political activity. And I started going wait a second, this is not what I see in the scripture. And it took me a long time to untangle that because I don't know, Corey, I tend to give people the benefit of the doubt. There's maybe that's somewhat biblical in the sense that we are supposed to offer each other grace. But I now look back on it and I'm like, oh, I was really naive. I just assumed people actually genuinely believed what they said. And there are people within the Christian evangelical community that clearly do not practice the ways of Jesus. They are about the power. They are about the money, the prestige. And it took me a while to see that.
So I'm curious what it was that happened coming up on 20 years ago. If you're not comfortable talking about the specifics, we don't have to, but I'm curious if that was just a personal revelation or maybe a personal failure or somebody did something to you or.
Yeah, it was a relationship that I thought was going to work out one way, and it didn't work out. And there was a lot of, kind of trying to dig deep and understand what my contributions to its failure, and my bottom line takeaway from that moment. And I should say, like, the Lord identifies places where I'm weak or where I am sinful all the time. So it's not like it's one and done, but like at that particular moment, it was just realizing that I wanted to be in control, that it was, I had my life planned out. I had I was going to make it happen come hell or high water. And when it didn't happen, having to deal with that was it really broke me, but in a beautiful, sweet way, right? Like that it is in that brokenness when we realize, oh, right, I am human. I do have limitations. Actually, none of us have control. We want control. Like it's a perfectly normal human idol to want control, but I actually don't have control. And there's such freedom in recognizing that, and also still something that I struggle with daily, right? Like it's not like you have this one moment, have an aha, and like, oh, like I'm perfectly sanguine with not knowing what's happening tomorrow. No, like I still wrestle with that, but I wrestle with it not in conflict with God, but like you leveraging, not leveraging, but working with the Lord to be at peace and trusting Him. And funny enough, control is actually one of the key idols I identify in the book, that I think is leading our community to feel that violence might be needed. The world has changed, like fast, rapidly. Like we're dealing with like unprecedented uncertainty that humans like throughout the millennia have never dealt with before. And it's completely normal that in such rapid change for us to like really want to hold on tight. Like, oh my God, like I don't like this. And that's like really a normal human reaction. And yet our scriptures tell us that our trust can't be in human beings. Our trust is not in ourselves. It's not in horses or chariots or kings. Our trust is in Christ alone. Our hope is in Christ alone. And in some ways, going through that experience nearly 20 years ago, it definitely prepared me for what the broader community started wrestling with 10 years ago.
So it's interesting. You do point out in the book, at one point you say, from the worst parts of the heresy trials known as the Inquisition to Christianizing the world through conquest, colonialism, and forced conversions, the Christian faith has been exploited for extremist violence and power throughout history. So if you would, how do you see this playing out today?
Yeah, so I really struggled with the title, whether I should call this Christian extremism. And the reality is the version of what we have today is different. It's a little bit more nuanced than, say, what we saw during the Inquisition or what we saw during the Crusades. But I think maybe the way to start is to give my definition of extremism. And I use a definition that an academic created, J.M. Berger. And his definition is that extremism is when you're in group. So in this case, the Christian community, the conservative community, perceives a threat from an outgroup to its success or survival. And let me pause there and say, I think that's our politics generally, right? Like every politician tells the voters, like, your success or survival is threatened if the other guy gets elected, right? So we like are constantly saturated in this first part of the definition. It's like the water we swim in. But the next part is, and therefore, hostile action is necessary. And that's what's really shifted in the last 10 years. It used to be that the answer to the perceived threat to our success or survival was go out and vote, or go raise money to advocate for your cause. And that was like, that's the way that democracy is supposed to function, right? Like, we advocate for our causes, we maybe get out and get involved in our communities and seek change through that. But what shifted is that the nature of that us versus them threat has taken on this overtone of apocalyptic, that it's existential, and you frequently see this. You see this on both sides. I should say it's not unique to the right. That this election is going to be the one that leads us to lose our country. Our children are not going to have the life that we had. The pastors are going to be thrown in jail for teaching the scriptures. These are all things I heard like in church frequently. And that's kind of the way the community has been operating. You can dial that back to the 1970s, 1980s. Those messages were pretty frequent in the more politicized versions of evangelicalism. It's just that in the last 10 years, the solution has also become like taking on overtones of pretty dark stuff, overtones of like, we need to make sure we're stocking up weapons. We need to, be prepared for like when Obama's going to come for our guns. We, all the way to what we saw on January 6th, like this lie that the election was stolen. Which, hey, if it were true, then that would be really difficult for the country to grapple with, right? Like, the system had failed, an election was stolen, and somebody was ascending to the presidency illegally. But even then, I think I would argue there are nonviolent means to address that wrong. And we have a system of checks and balances, and there's a right way to address that. What the community was seeded as in like planted for years is that someday this is going to happen. Someday the government's going to overstep and they're going to take your rights away. So you need to be prepared to be like those patriots from 1776 and defend your family and defend your country. And so like we've been operating in narratives like that for some time. So when the moment happens, it becomes rather easy for President Trump to bring people to the Capitol, and he doesn't have to tell them much, right? Because they've already been talking about this for decades.
Yeah.
That you got to do something.
And now it's creeping into so many different places. There was this pregnancy center here in town that I supported for a long time, pro-life based pregnancy center. And then one year I went to the annual, the big dinner fundraiser thing. And one speaker after another, it was a benign version of it, but it was an us versus them mentality that crept into one speech after another. They are trying to do this to us. They are trying to, and I had to stop supporting it because I'm like, that level of generalization and demonization is not serving they were doing so much good work in terms of caring for women, but to the degree that they were raising money based on an us versus them mentality. I was curious though, you mentioned about that language creeping into some of our churches. I would imagine though that you've seen it. Do you see right-wing media as somewhat of a recruiting tool as well?
Absolutely. I mean, the reality is that this originated in right-wing media. You often hear pastors talk about, I get the parishioners 1 hour a week. Fox News has them 24/7, right? So there's like a disproportionate level of influence that a pastor could have, right? Which is why if you are not saturated and anchored in God's word, and that's your North Star, so to speak, and instead you're taking in whatever is on Fox News or Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity, or worse, like a Tucker Carlson or an OAN. And I mean worse in that their rhetoric tends to walk up and cross over into extremist rhetoric more frequently, that's going to program how you view the world, right? So we as believers need to be very cautious in what we are intaking, because there is no way that what we take in doesn't affect the way that we see things or view the world or how we respond in a crisis moment. So I certainly pastors, especially those that are trying to do the right thing, are in a very difficult situation when they have parishioners who are much more saturated about the politics of the day than they are the teachings of Jesus. So that is no doubt a part of the challenge. Like, the news echo chambers created the outrage cycle, right? So we live in this perpetual state of the way media gets money, the way that they get clicks is through outrage. Fear and anger are one of the most compelling drivers from a marketing standpoint. So they are completely designed, including our algorithms on our phones, right? Our algorithms are designed to evoke an emotional reaction, and that makes them money. So that's how you end up with some of these stories coming out about what Fox News anchors were saying on air, and then they were writing emails after their shows going, "This is preposterous, we can't keep this up," right? Like, so they don't actually believe what they might be saying on air, but it's entertainment and it's about the money, right?
Mm.
Like, they're a performer. Well, that's problematic, because that's people
The
are actually
understatement
thinking,
of the year.
right,
It's problematic.
right, like, it's very problematic. Like, we thought, journalism was supposed to be about seeking the truth. If it's actually a form of entertainment, well, let's use that differently then. Let's not use them as our primary fact checker for what's true. If you treat them like your Friday night movie night, right?
Yeah.
Or you go to movies on the weekend. Sure, you want to have a little dose of entertainment. I don't have a problem with that. It's when that's all you get and you have no actual basic facts. That totally skews your perception of the world. And it makes it impossible for you to actually have the ability to discern fact from fiction, because all you're ingesting is the entertainment.
Yeah. Before we move on, I wanted to tell you about something else that's important. Money. Specifically your money. In all seriousness, I wanted to tell you about my advisor and my friend, George Meza. George runs Meza Wealth Management. And with George, it's not just about money. It's about helping us manage our present and plan for our future. And unlike a lot of other firms out there, George and I actually have a relationship. He knows me, he knows my family, and I know his wonderful family. I also know his firm and the incredible team he's put together, from his chief investment officer to some of the other great people in his office, like Jessica, their head of operations, that are always there to help me and with all aspects of our portfolio. You see, the thing is, I got a lot going on. I guess we all got a lot going on, and I don't have the time to watch our investments all day, every day. And even if I did, I don't have the experience and expertise that George's team collectively has. So we get the entire Meza Wealth Management team, all their expertise and all their integrity. And again, it's based on George knowing me personally, knowing my goals, and even the kind of risk that's appropriate for me to take, which, by the way, could change from one season to the next. And they're on top of all of that. So if you want George Meza and Meza Wealth Management to be on your team, just visit their website, mezawealth.com. That's MEZA wealth.com, www.mezawealth.com. And that will also be in our show notes, so you can check that. And now, back to our show. I really appreciated the appendices too. The first appendix, you started out talking about how you talk to tweens and teens. Yeah. Have you and Gil started teaching the kids on how to be better consumers of the news, or better if they are on social? I don't know if they're on social media yet, but okay, that's a big no. But how are you talking to the kids now about being better engaged, more informed citizens, whether it is on social, in person, or how they're consuming the news?
Yeah. So on the topic of kids, I kind of use the example of what we have learned, it's a little different than when we were growing up and what our parents were told. What we have learned about how you talk to your kids about sex and drugs, you also need to apply in the space of extremism and just in general, like the nature of media and social media. You want to talk early. You want to talk often in small chunks. You don't want to like overwhelm them, and age appropriate, as well as like every kid's a little different. So the goal is not to scare them. The goal is to just make them aware so that when they come across certain things, they feel comfortable coming to you and asking about it. So I have a 12-year-old and a 10-year-old. Actually, he's almost 13. I have an almost 13-year-old and a 10-year-old. And we set boundaries really early on that they were not going to have a phone until high school. We set boundaries that social media was probably off limits until 16. And I anchored that in evidence. Now, I have the benefit of, because of the field that I'm in, I'm aware of a lot of the data that comes out. And there's, thankfully, in the last 3 or 4 years, has just been an overwhelming amount of evidence. And Jonathan Haidt's book.
I was just thinking that, The Anxious Generation.
Yeah, like I read some of his early stuff, and his book just came out, so I didn't have the benefit of having that when I was writing. But I will tell you, my reaction was like, oh my gosh, this is coddling the American mind.
The 2015 or 2017, I forget when it came out.
And I was like, this might be why we have such a spike in extremism.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh.
I need to caveat, like, studies have not been done. It is not, but it is one of my strong hypotheses, and I kind of reference it in the book that some of the findings in that book about how social media and the lack of play have rewired their kid's brain.
Yeah.
And it creates an us-them context was one of their findings, which is like precursor narratives for extremism. It creates a perception of like anything that is antagonistic towards your viewpoint makes you evil and me good. So there were like a number of findings that they had that I look at and I go, oh, that's what we see in individuals that go and join terrorist groups. Those are like the precursor things that make up their psychology that allow them to be susceptible to radicalization.
So if I can make a recommendation, his co-author on the coddling of the American mind, Greg Lukianoff. So you're familiar with the book that Lukianoff just wrote with what's his co-author's name? She's brilliant.
Ricky Schott.
Right. So canceling.
And I might be mispronouncing that.
Yeah. Ricky Schlott. Yeah.
Okay.
And Ricky, I think, was a student when they started this project together of Haidt at the NYU at Stern School of Business. And now she's a prolific author and writer herself. But the canceling of the American mind, and they do have a number of surveys that have been done in more recent years about this very thing. I did want to take a step back though for a second, because you have a really interesting experience. The way I look at a lot of your public service is there are these bookends, 9/11 and January 6th. One thing I was really curious about is it sounds like your time in the Bush administration was very, very different than your time in the Trump administration. And I was wondering, to the degree that you can, I'm sure that there's a lot of information that you're not privileged to share, but I was hoping that you could create a profile for us in what some of those differences were.
Sure. I am so grateful for the opportunity that I had in the Bush administration, because it helped me, and there were many of us that had served in Bush and came and served in Trump, not because we were Trump fans, but because we had been asked. You have this practical experience as a former Republican administration official. Can you come help? And that's kind of how Washington works. You often have people from previous administrations on the same party come in and support. And it definitely was an important experience, because there were so many moments where you kind of were like, what, am I crazy? In the Trump administration, like what's happening here? Like, and being able to think back and go, okay, how did my boss in the Bush administration handle this? Okay, that's my standard of normal. And this is not normal. And so recognizing that, it sounds so simple to be able to say this was normal, this is not normal, but in the middle of that chaos, you actually needed to constantly have some sort of anchor of like, okay, remind me what normal is. Okay.
Yeah.
How can we try to kind of get back to that normal, even though like everything was out against you? So here are some of the examples. In the Bush administration, we were told by Andy Card, he was the chief of staff, the first chief of staff in the first term. It is a privilege and an honor to work for the American people. The moment that you don't either have the energy, you've just given it all that you have, or you just are burned out, or you're frustrated, whatever it is, it's time for you to move on, because there are thousands of other people that would take your job. And they just drove it into us. This is an act of public service. You give it your all. It is not about you. When I left the White House, you get a photo with the president, and you get to go into the Oval Office. And I was a young staffer. I had never been in the Oval Office before, so it was really special. I had my family with me. And I remember saying to President Bush, like, it was just such an honor to serve you. And he said, you didn't serve me, you served the American people. And that was the entire emphasis, and it was drilled into us over and over and over again. It is not about you. It is not about Bush. It is about the American people. Now, that does not mean that there weren't people in the Bush administration who made it about themselves, or didn't practice good public service, or made bad decisions. It's not that. It's that the ethos that was drilled into the 3,000 of us that were political appointees, that was our norm. You flash forward to Trump, I don't think we ever got any sort of guidance from any chief of staff about how to view our service. And it certainly wasn't public service. It was service to Trump. Like the loyalty there was not, are you loyal to the United States? Are you giving it at all because you're serving the public? It was, are you loyal to Trump? And that was the key difference for me.
You just reminded me of that. There was a cabinet get together where they let cameras in, and they went around to the cabinet secretaries, and it was all, what a honor of a lifetime to serve Trump. It got to Mattis, though. Do you remember Jim Mattis?
I do remember.
Yeah.
This was early on. It was like one of the first cabinet meetings, and so we all watched it, and I just was like, what is happening?
Yeah.
What is happening? I was naive. I was like, this is bizarro world. What is happening? Man.
Yeah, it's like a bad movie. But I bring that up partly because you did work for bosses that you clearly have a lot of respect for to this day. You worked for John Kelly, you worked for Kirstjen Nielsen. So it wasn't the people who worked there. It wasn't all just a bunch of drones, I'm curious though. Have you read any of the Project 2025?
Yes.
So they are explicitly, they're building a plan to explicitly, part of the job interview is, do you believe the 2020 election was stolen? Are you going to be loyal to Trump? You probably wouldn't have gotten hired for.
In 2020, I was getting pushed out for a variety of reasons, but there was like one option for me to stay and go work on cybersecurity because nobody cared about cybersecurity. This tells you a lot, right? And cyber actually was kind of interesting to me. And what they weren't connecting dots on was that, the office that does cybersecurity was doing the election security. So it actually would have been really interesting to go and support Chris Krebs with that. So I was like contemplating doing that as I was getting pushed out. And they made this big change at presidential personnel, and Johnny McEntee came in, and he was like,
McEntee is one of the guys that's heading up Project 2025. That's so interesting.
He was a body man for Trump, meaning like he carried the bags for Trump in the first year or so. And John Kelly came in as chief of staff and discovered that there were a whole bunch of White House staff that had not cleared their security clearances, including this guy. And he was like, "You're out. You can't operate in the White House and not have a security clearance. It's especially as the body man, right? Like maybe if you're the person, across the street in the Eisenhower building that's answering phones, you don't need a security clearance. But if you're in the West Wing and you're the body man, you need a security clearance." So he was booted. Of course, later, John Kelly was removed as chief of staff. And towards the end in 2020, Johnny McEntee comes back. He gets put in charge of presidential personnel, and all presidential appointments stopped. We were in the process of hiring some people. All of them got put on hold. Everybody had to get rescreened and go through loyalty tests, including, that's when I decided, like, oh no, I'm not doing that, because I'm not going to lie. Like, no, right. I'm not voting for this man again. But including all of my friends that were still there, they had to go through loyalty tests. These are people like 20-year experienced national security professionals who are getting asked to come back and interview for the jobs that they've been operating in for 3 years. And they're not being asked like for their credentials, like for like, what's your policy plans for the next term? It was, are you sufficiently loyal to Donald Trump? Like, it was appalling to me. So it doesn't surprise me that that's their approach for 2025, because that's what they already tried to implement in 2020.
So I'm asking you to look into your crystal ball, and it's a scary one at that. But what do you think an administration will look like if Trump wins another term?
There won't be many adults left in the room. I say that with one caveat. Upon reflection, like when I left and had time to start talking to people who had served in different departments and agencies, there were places in the administration where things were quasi-normal. They might have had a good cabinet secretary. That cabinet secretary might have been given a lot of deference to run things the way that they wanted to run. And as long as Trump didn't pay attention to them too often, you could run things pretty normally. So you often hear people talk about, hey, that policy that got implemented, that was really good. I would like to see that again. That's why I'm going to vote for Trump. And the thing that I would like people to understand is that Trump didn't come up with that policy. Trump didn't implement that policy. Most of the time, the way the policy process worked was like, how do we avoid having to take something to the president? Because you never knew what was going to come out of it. Like, it kind of was dependent on his mood. He doesn't focus. He doesn't read. He's not a very, he didn't care about the policy unless he got a phone call from one of the media personalities at Fox that like to chew his ear on things. So you really kind of try to avoid having to take things to the president for decision. And so consequently, there are a few areas where if you're a conservative, you look at the policy successes in the Trump administration and you're like, hey, let's just do more of that. The problem is that one, those maybe domestic policy successes are highly dependent upon a stable national security picture.
Right.
Where we didn't have stability was on the national security realm, especially at the Department of Homeland Security, primarily because Stephen Miller has a very strong agenda that he was trying to implement, and he was a Trump whisperer. He knew how to get Trump to say yes to his stuff, and so he was implementing pretty significant policy changes through the Department of Homeland Security, kind of outside of the normal process. And a lot of those policies, we had lawyers and seasoned national security officials say, no, this is illegal, this is unconstitutional. And then they would get fired and they would bring somebody in who wouldn't say those things. Right. So what does 2025 look like? All of those people that they brought in who either didn't know any better, because some of them were like fresh out of college. They were putting 24-year-olds into roles that were normally in a normal administration would be held by somebody with 20 years experience.
Right.
So you're going to have a lot of inexperienced people who are very loyal, who will just do whatever the person that is holding the lever. So in the case of immigrations, it would be Stephen Miller. In the case of, are we getting out of NATO? There are certain ideologues who have like very strong opinions about that, and they will be able to implement what they want to do. So it's not really Trump's vision. It's just he has these ideologues around him, and they will get free rein at that point because they will successfully leave out anybody that would throw up a roadblock to them, and they'll just stack the agencies with inexperienced people who don't know any better, or perhaps actually have malicious intent themselves. So it's a much more unstable world in a second Trump administration. We likely get pulled out of NATO. I don't know. I don't know about Ukraine. Like I think he ends up withdrawing our support from Ukraine. I think that allows Russia to kind of take over, and then Putin has indicated that he won't stop at Ukraine. So then we're ending up in a much more dangerous scenario if Putin starts to take NATO territory. What happens to NATO, especially if we pulled out? So you end up with a very changed world dynamic in a 2025 Trump administration. And I realize that for most Americans who have very little memories, either because most of us weren't alive. Most of us were not alive in World War II. And I think what we have done a poor job in educating the American public on is that as flawed as the system is, the reason that we have stability and economic prosperity in the United States is because of the post-World War II infrastructure that was created. Now, I'm all for having policy debates about how to reform those systems, how to do better, but scrapping it and just like saying we shouldn't do NATO anymore, we shouldn't do the UN anymore, we shouldn't station our troops overseas anymore leads to death and destruction, not only overseas but in the United States. It's very short-sighted to assume that the US can withdraw and everything will be fine and we can just stay isolated. That's just, history says that that's not the case.
And ironically, it seems
it
seems to be one of the least conservative things we could do. I think it was G.K. Chesterton who told a story about, or used the illustration of a wall. So some folks, their tendency is, well, there's a wall, why don't we take it down? But a conservative is, well, let's at least understand why the wall is there before we start removing it. One of the things that we haven't talked about too much yet is January 6th, the other bookend that I referred to. I was listening to an interview you did with Charlie Sykes in December of 2020. So it was after the election, after a lot of the 60 plus cases had been decided, not so coincidentally by many of which were by Trump appointed judges. So there was a bit of optimism. But one part of the conversation with Charlie, this must have been like the middle of, it was right before the holidays. So December 15th ish, right? You had a pretty clear vision of what was going to happen. And you even mentioned January 6th specifically. What were you seeing that you understood? Not only January 6th was going to be bad, but you were concerned about what was going to happen after January 6th. So what were you seeing at that time that raised red flags for you? Did it play out like you were afraid it was going to play out, better or worse? Like, tell me about what you were seeing then.
It was worse than I expected. My job is to look at intel tea leaves and think about policy solutions, right? Like, so the way my brain works is I see intel. Intel is never perfect. You never have a full picture of what's happening. But you're in the security community, the MO is over respond because that can de-escalate threat. So what I was watching were narratives, one that were very untrue, like the election was being stolen, and certain influencers like the Steve Bannons, like the Michael Flynn's, who were churning and amping the conversation up. There had been a rally in Washington, D.C. in mid-December. And I think that was probably where I was like, oh gosh, this is not good. People are mobilizing, like people are disrupting their daily life. Like it is December, the holidays are coming, and people are saying, hold off on the Christmas pageant. I got to go to Washington, D.C. and protest. So that was certainly a key indicator that I was nervous that the people that were orchestrating and trying to incite people were successfully inciting them, right? Like, so you were watching the other news feed was the rotating door
right.
of various people coming in with their conspiracy theories to the Oval Office. And we were hearing, whether it was Rudy Giuliani or the My Pillow guy, and
Jenna Ellis.
And so every week, you're every day, really, like there would be somebody else out in front of the West Wing, reporting on their meeting with the president. And you just kind of were starting to watch, like, this is spiraling.
Right.
And around this time, I don't know if it was before or after Charlie's podcast, Bill Barr retired or resigned.
Yeah. It was
Bill
almost
Barr,
exactly that time. Yeah.
Yeah. Bill Barr when we were serving with him, I just remember having hope that he would be stronger.
Yeah.
In his pushback on Trump than he mostly was. But at the end there, he was like, it's the same thing with Pence, right? Like Pence did the right thing. Now, I wish that Pence had been stronger throughout the administration. But when, it really mattered, Pence did the right thing. And so when you started to see some of those people drop like flies, you're realizing like he can't be constrained anymore, because that's what we did. That was our whole job for 3 years. I can't tell you how many hours we spent, Corey, strategizing how to present something to the president so that he would make the right decision. It just was like,
that's scary.
It was so crazy, but that's what we did. It was like
Jedi mind tricking the president,
Yes, like we were trying to follow the Constitution. Like he should make this decision, but no, normal president, right? President Bush.
Yeah.
When we would write decision memos, and my boss would go and brief the president. One, we were representing agency views, and two, you would come up with like 3 options. Usually one option is like a really bad option. Like nobody really wants that option. Then there's like the ideal option that like somebody really is going to advocate for, but then there's a middle ground that makes everybody happy, right? Like that's how you do it. In 2017, everybody was doing things like normal. And so we would go in with like, this is the bad option. Nobody's going to choose that. But he would choose that option. And we were like, oh no, we can't give him any bad options.
Wow.
We've got to like only give him, there is like only one right answer, or, a modification on the right answer. You can't give him choices because his instinct is to go to the worst choice. So that was the system we were operating in for 3 years. And then you start seeing the last remnants of the guys holding it together and keeping him somewhat tied to reality. When you start to hear, back channel that Jared and Ivanka don't have any sway anymore, that's when you started to go like, okay, this is a powder keg here. You've got the influencers like Michael Flynn, using language that implies violence. Do you remember there was like somebody, I can't even remember who it was, but they suggested that a public servant, maybe it was Chris Krebs, needed to be either hanged or their throat slit. Like there was like some really violent language being used by influencers. And so you have that cauldron, and then you have a president who is clearly looking at all of the options to how do I stay in power. And there were rumors going on. I had friends calling and saying like, oh, he's doing weird stuff at DOD. We don't understand what's happening at DOD. They're like putting in people, and I think he might be he's talking about the Insurrection Act. So it was there were multiple places where we were concerned that something could go sideways really quickly and violence might be the result. So that was that moment. It wasn't like, oh, I think there are going to be a bunch of people that ransack the Capitol on January 6th. It just was, there is enough volatility here and angry people and a lot of lies that are inciting that violence, that something is going to happen.
You know, what's interesting, you're reminding me of what happened in June of 2020, leading up to, it was like a preview of what was to come. But a lot of the other senior officials, Mark Milley and other officials that cleared Lafayette Square, kind of violently cleared Lafayette Square. But almost every one of the other guys that were involved in that have subsequently denounced their participation in it, except for Trump, obviously. But that leads me to another question. You did describe, you were talking about January 6th, and you described an evolution, that there was an evolution aided and abetted by a church that has lost its soul. There's so much else I want to talk to you about that we won't have time for today. But what do you mean by that? Aided and abetted by a church that has lost its soul?
Extremist groups often use religious language, scriptures, symbols, to kind of give them additional authority for what they're doing. So that, like, if you study, it could be domestic extremist movements from 50 years ago. It can be, back to the Crusades, right? Like it is a pretty common thing to see extremists co-opt religion. And so in one sense, this is not new, but this particular political violence movement that happened on January 6th, but January 6th is one moment. There are plenty of other examples of violence associated with this movement that just weren't nearly as spectacular. There is a thread that I think many people have explored lots of different angles on, that this has been, that Christians were a part of this movement or are a part of this movement, and or you also have people who are like, I am not Christian, but I'm for Christian values, or I'm for this being a Christian nation. Let me give you an extreme example. The Buffalo shooter who targeted Black people at a grocery store in Buffalo, New York, he, in his manifesto, talks about how he is not a Christian. He doesn't hold those religious beliefs, but he does believe that we should adhere to Western European values, and that is Christendom, and so therefore we should be, a Christian nation. So when people use that phrase, they often mean different things.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes this topic so hard, is that you say Christian nationalism or you say Christian extremism, and immediately, based on whatever your past experience is, like, you were coming to the table with, oh, well, that has to mean this thing. And it actually means a whole lot of little things that culminated together and really honed in around Trump. Like, Trump has become a messiah figure for this movement. And you see Trump play into that Christian theme when he says things like, we're going to make Christianity great again.
Yeah.
Or when he promotes a Bible.
Christian Visibility Day.
Christian Visibility Day. Yeah. Right? Like, so he is, he started this a long time ago. Like, in his 2016 campaign, he gave a speech that basically said, like, I will defend Christianity. And like, a lot of evangelicals heard that and they were like, yes, I've been wanting somebody to defend me. Now, look, this kind of goes to Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff's book again. There is a legitimate grievance for people of faith that the far left and sometimes the mainstream left have so rapidly changed their views on what is the accepted norm. And because they hold power in certain spaces in the country, they have increasingly heaped shame on people that hold traditional Christian values. And that's wrong. The progressive left should not be doing that. It's fine to have a different viewpoint, but you can discuss those viewpoints without canceling somebody or without shaming somebody for holding a view that, quite frankly, has been the norm for 2,000 years.
Yeah.
Now, that like, I'm not saying that all of our views for 2,000 years are good views, but we need to be able to have conversations about them in a way that doesn't demonize the other. And
Right.
much of what the Christian community has been reacting to, and why they were looking for a strong man, started from that space of progressives shaming traditional, middle-class American viewers, or not viewers, middle-class American people who hold Christian or conservative viewpoints. And so they found in Trump somebody who was willing to push back for them. And he has been, seeding that or playing into that for now going on 8 years. The problem with it, of course, is that in the actual Christian faith, there is only one Messiah. We only need one Savior. And the Bible explicitly warns against putting our trust in princes and kings.
Yeah.
They will always, always fail us. So there's like this interesting tension here of the grievance is real. The grievance is, valid is maybe the way to put it. But the solution that the community came to was not the way of Jesus. The way of Jesus would say, we turn the other cheek. The way of Jesus would say, we are winsome. The way of Jesus says we're salt and light. The way of Jesus acknowledges that we will be persecuted for Christ. Like, that means we're doing it right. That means we're actually in good company with most believers in the last 2,000 millennia, or the last 2,000 years.
Yeah.
And instead, a politician and some parts of the church have believed that no, we got to fight for it. The ways of Jesus are antiquated and not relevant in our present moment, and we need to do things differently to protect ourselves.
I'm reminded, I'm in Kings right now. So that, I've told folks, I just start in Genesis 1, keep reading until I get to Revelation 22, start all over again. So I'm in Kings now. And this is not anything new. What we're going through is not anything new. And I'm thinking like, okay, I grant you, maybe Trump is a little bit like one of the kings from the Bible, but it's more like this guy that did evil in the sight of the Lord and allowed for, or even led people to set up the Asherah poles and anyway, so that's a whole other, that's maybe for our Bible study. We should do like a Bible study and do this. Anyway.
The book was twice as long as it ended up because I had so many of those biblical themes in there. And my editor was like, nobody can get through all of this, Elizabeth. And I always joke, like, I do have many words. But I do, like, there's a part of me that wants to do a Bible study on this because I just think there's so many obvious points of scripture to pull out here that what the way that our community is walking is just not consistent with what the Bible teaches.
So again, if you haven't come across it, I'm sure you have, you and Gil have, but David French, Russ, Dr. Moore, and Curtis Chang have done the After Party. It is such a worthwhile study. And if you could do it with a group of folks, believers or non-believers, just to get clarity, to ask good questions, to go back to scripture, and not just little shards and little pieces, a half a verse here and a half a verse there, but like chunks of scripture, the way a better way to do it. One other question that I had for you. So I don't know if you saw this, but I gave a little preview of your book and said, I just quoted from I didn't even say that we were going to be talking, but I quoted from the book about, how you can start to detect extremists or people that are kind of going in that direction. And I just put the picture of the book and the title up on online. And my buddy, I love this guy. Believe it or not, I just have such a heart for this guy. My buddy John, that I graduated from the same high school with, he was the first comment. He goes, cool, since she's such an expert on extremism and the dangers to our society, maybe next she can write a book about inner city violence and destroying our cities and inner city schools and, ideal DEI and BLM. And he just goes off. And I don't ask me why. I just love this guy. So I bring up my buddy John because I'd imagine you get tons of comments just like that online or perhaps in person. So have you faced that sort of pushback at church or, in other walks of life? And if so, how do you deal with it?
Yeah. So the whataboutism is real.
That should be a bumper sticker. The whataboutism is real.
So look, both can be true. The city of Portland has massive problems. UC Berkeley did not handle their protests in 2017 correctly.
Yeah.
And we're reaping the consequences of that now.
And Stanford, even just recent incidents. So yeah, it's happening all over the country.
We do have a problem. I am more inclined to think that some of that problem is tied to what we've already referenced, that Generation Z has had their brains wired differently than the rest of us because of social media and a lack of play in their childhood. And that's a finding from Jonathan Haidt. It was kind of alluded to in that 2017 book we've talked about that he wrote with Greg Lukianoff, and his new one that just came out last month, The Anxious Generation, kind of really unpacks and says, no, it's not just corollary, it's causal.
Yeah.
Our kids are different. They think and see the world differently than we did. And they, in some ways, have had outsized influence on the older generations because of social media, because of the amplification process that happens, in a way that, like, when you and I were 20 somethings, like, nobody cared what we thought, right? But like, you actually have Gen Z interns at the White House getting meetings with the president to be able to express their frustration over the White House's handling of Israel and Gaza's conflict. And you're like, never in a million years would a White House intern in the Bush administration be allowed to go and like tell him that he's wrong. Like, it boggles my mind that that's where we are, that we have a younger generation that thinks they have it all figured out. And because they have the ability to amplify their voices, like, the older generations now have to be like, okay, how can I help educate you here? Because you don't actually know the full story. So we're dealing with like a very difficult thing societally that has, like, one of the consequences of that is more violence. So when you look at it either individually or as a community-wide problem, I do think some of this is coming from something that might seem completely unrelated. Like, why is the violence or the problems in Portland tied to, like, kids that don't have enough play in childhood, and they formed their identity online through social media, went through adolescence on their phone instead of having in-person contact? Why does that somehow translate to violence? I don't know that we fully know the answers, but I think we know enough to know that it's not good. Like, right. It's having individual problems, like suicide rates are up, anxiety and depression is up. There's another book that was out last year about boys and like the challenges that boys are having. They just don't find meaning in life anymore. Like, these are really important things that both as a parent and as a productive member of society, I feel like we have to grapple with. And I think that is part of the answer or the reason behind why we're seeing cities on decline and why we're seeing rises in extremist violence. Now, all of that said, in the book, I lay out there are far left movements. There are people that associate with anti-fascism. Antifa is like the shorthand name. It is not an organized group. Generally, on the far left, they tend to be less organized. They tend to be more loosely affiliated.
Will Rogers knew that in like 1910.
The funny thing about anarchist extremists is, like, because they don't believe in anything that's organized, they tend to not be very effective in their extremism. So far left is a thing. There are occasionally acts of violence, but generally the far left when they act out, it tends to be more property damage and like bar fight brawl style protest, counter protest interactions. It still causes damage. It's still bad, but it's very different than all of the data that shows the type of violence that the far right is responsible for. On the far right, we have more deaths. We have more attacks. We have more physical harm to people by multitudes more than the far left. So if you're in government and you have limited resources, the first priority is you protect life, and then the second priority is you're protecting property. So there is kind of a focus here of we keep losing people to mass shootings, to attempted bombings, to other forms of violence coming from the far right. And on the far left, it tends to be things that local police have the capability to handle.
Right.
Now, clearly they're not handling it well in Portland, but when I get asked about, like, we got to do something about Portland, my answer is I'm a conservative and I believe in the 10th Amendment. The job of Portland is for the people of Portland and Oregon to address. Like, they have a vote, they have the ability to hold their elected officials accountable, and they should exercise that vote. I grew up in Texas. I don't want somebody from New York coming to Texas and telling me how to run things in Texas. I imagine that the people in Portland don't want the people of Texas to tell them how to run their city. And look, the people of Texas who see when I'm picking on Texas because I'm from there and I go home and I talk to a lot of friends and family there, they have this outsized fear of what's happening in Portland, that somehow that's going to happen in Texas. And you're kind of like, well, I don't see the people of Portland coming and trying to take over the city of Dallas.
Right.
And by the way, if they tried, I have a great faith in the people of Texas saying, like, get out of our state, right? Like, there's like, we kind of
the whole try that in a small town kind of, that whole thing.
There's this unrealistic fear, and I don't mean to make fun of it, because I have talked to people who are actually genuinely afraid. Like, do I need to move out of this? I live in the city of Dallas. Is the city of Dallas going to turn into Portland? Do I need to move like to the rural communities so that my family is safe? And it often is coming from a place of genuine concern. They're not trying to, what about, they're just, how do I keep my family safe? So I think, and I always answer that with empathy. No, I am not concerned that Dallas is going to turn into Portland. But I think it's a good reminder that who you elect to your city council, who you elect as your mayor, and who you elect as your state representative has way more influence on your day-to-day life than who you elect for president. We've totally upended our politics, and we've paid way more attention to some guy in a White House thousands of miles away from us, but don't actually pay attention. Like, can't name the name of our mayors or our city council person. Like, that's a problem. They're supposed to be like keeping you safe. And if they're failing at that, they need to hear from you, and you need to be engaged locally well before you're ever engaged nationally.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely one of the things that we've been talking about for a while, which, by the way, there's 6 or 7 states only where the presidential election is even up for grabs. So, the fact that our state senator for the state legislature is coming up here this year, that's an important race. I happen to be supporting a lady named Suzette Valadares. One of the reasons I'm supporting her is because she doesn't see her Democratic colleagues as enemies, that when she was in the assembly, that she supported bipartisan legislation. She had an article just the other day about insurance policies are being pulled by the tens of thousands here in California. So she had solution-based suggestions, a piece of legislation that she tried to advance when she was in the assembly that got unanimous bipartisan support. So that really does have, like, if I can afford homeowners insurance here, that has an effect on my day-to-day life. So much more I could talk to you about, Elizabeth. This has been great. There really is. But I do want to ask you our TP&R question, and that is, what do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with, have better conversations with, perhaps even nurture relationships with people across our differences? So that's people who have different backgrounds than we do, different beliefs than we do, who get their news from different sources than we do? How can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other? Or is it even possible?
Totally is possible. We do not have to be stuck in this do loop that we're in. Look, one of the solutions that I offer in part 2 of the book is that proximity to people that are different, and it's different beliefs, but also different experiences, is a really important protective factor. Because when we see that the other person is a human being with similar feelings and concerns. They want good things for their kids. They are worried about something, and you share that worry, and like realizing, oh, they're a human being just like me. We just have different perspectives or different experiences. That helps us be resilient against the us-them narratives that get thrown at us every day. So I think it's super important to engage with people with different experiences, to travel, to get outside of your bubble, whether that's going from your predominantly blue state to a predominantly red state or vice versa, or going overseas. I think the Christians that I have met, I always ask somebody when they have, when it becomes clear that they are not a part of the MAGA movement and that they are very disappointed in what's happened in the church, I always ask them if they had traveled overseas at all and spent any time with Christians from different countries. And inevitably, the answer is yes. There is something really powerful about being reminded that Christ is worshipped across the globe by people very different than us. And in some ways, they can see things and see gifts of the Bible and of Jesus in ways that we are blinded to here in the United States. And so getting out and experiencing those different perspectives is really, really important. Okay, so how do you have those conversations? Start with prayer, especially if somebody that is like really important in your life. It's harder to do it when it's like a loved one. I think it's easier to do it with somebody that maybe the stakes are lower. So maybe you want to practice with strangers before you go to the Thanksgiving dinner table and try to practice it there. But I think that part of the trick is the goal can't be to win somebody to your perspective. The goal has to be that you're curious about their perspective. And look, over time, they might pick up on what you're doing and model it back to you, but initially they're not. Initially, they're just going to tell you why they're right and why you're wrong. And you want to enter that space with empathy, truth, accountability, but empathy, right? Like the goal is to maintain relationship with people. It's not to persuade them to your point of view. And if you're curious and you ask open-ended questions, you often can get to a space where they might ask back, well, why do you believe the way you do? And right. that can then create space for learning and potential growth. But in those spaces where you have a loved one, especially that you just don't see eye to eye, the relationship is so much more important than your disagreement over politics. So, anchor it in your love for them. Sometimes I have to ask the Lord to fill me with his love so that I can offer it to that loved one. It's not always easy, but it is an important part of our ministry of reconciliation.
Yeah, that's fine. Sometimes I come away thinking, man, in a way, I'm glad I'm not Jesus. Like I got Jesus, like I got the Holy Spirit in me, but I'm glad that I'm not Jesus because I can't love this person. I know Jesus does, but I don't know. I don't have it in me. So, but
true.
Yeah,
true.
I love that. I love that. So, do you have any questions for me?
Oh, I do. I am curious if, how you would, now that you've read the book and we've talked about some of this, I use the term Christian extremism. And I'm just curious if you think that's going to be a hard thing to navigate. Is it going to turn people off before I can even persuade them to hear my concerns? Or is it appropriate that we are provocative a little bit and help people see that maybe we're no better than the people that attacked us on 9/11.
That's interesting. So this might not sound like a direct answer to your question, but it is. When I first came to the Lord, over the course of that first year or two, what I realized was that there were so many different people that were witnessing to me, and they're all in their own ways. Some were confrontational. Some just took me to a ball game. Some had me over for a meal, all these different ways. And the way I see that is that it's like everybody's part of the orchestra, but God's the one who wrote the score, and God is the one who's conducting the orchestra. Mm. So you might be, a big drum, or a horn. There's plenty of space for violins. There's plenty of space for harps. We need all of it. So that's yes, this is going to come across in my own experience. People think I'm joking around about getting kicked out of Bible studies, but I've gotten kicked out of not just Bible studies. There was a couples weekend that we were asked to leave early, and my crime was that I did it in my Jersey way. So I'm kind of a jerk sometimes, my Jersey jerk comes out. But my crime was that I said, hey, fellas, we got to keep reading this thing, because the end of the chapter says something very different than your a priori political prejudices that you got, but I'm still having conversations with guys that were at that weekend. That the very guys that threw me out, I'm still having. This is like 10 years ago. I'm still having those conversations.
That's so interesting.
Yeah. So, and listen, because again, I ain't Jesus. If there's two things that are the most irreducible beliefs for me, is one, there is a God, and two is I ain't him. So being very not God, my proclivity is sometimes to come across the wrong way, even if I'm in Scripture, even if the basis by which I'm making the argument is Scripture itself. I still do it in all the wrong way. I'm using it to hammer somebody over the head with, But we need that too. I'm not going to justify hammering somebody over the head with the Bible, but the messages that don't go down as easily, we do need that too. At the end of the day, I think ideally it's loving candor, but it's candor nonetheless. We got to reckon with this stuff. So yeah, that's what comes to mind.
Thank you. I appreciate hearing all of that. I like the symphony metaphor. That's really, really
That's
helpful.
right. That's right. So before we go, how can folks follow you, find more info about Kingdom of Rage, this really important forthcoming book, and all the great work that you're doing?
Thank you for asking that. You can go to elizabethneumann.org, and there's a page on there for the book. And if you click on that page, there's any number of links to all of your favorite bookstores where you can pre-order. The book is out April 23rd. And I am on socials at New Summits, NEUSUMMITS. Mostly active on X, but trying to figure out Instagram. That's really hard for me. Also on Threads and Facebook.
So we covered a lot, but I just want to make sure, is there anything, so we'll do this again. I hope, awesome. If you're into it. But before we go, is there anything important we haven't discussed that you want to just make sure to add for this one?
No, I think we covered everything.
All right, everything. We got it all covered.
Everything, yes.
That's awesome, Elizabeth. I just really enjoy spending time with you. This is really cool. Thank you for doing this. Thank
you, Corey. I really appreciate the dialogue, and always enjoy spending time with you. And thanks for the opportunity to talk more about the book.
Absolutely. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, just remember to follow and write that review. Tell a friend about Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. We are easy to recommend. Tell your friends to go to their favorite podcast app and type in Without Killing Each Other. And remember that there's no G in the killing. But just type in Without Killing Each Other. You'll find our big purple logo. Or you can find me online at Corey S. Nathan. That's Corey with an E. And S is in Scott at COREYSNATHAN. Corey S. Nathan. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect. Not like me sometimes, but have a great week.